Hi, hello there, and I'm Fran Costigan, the director of vegan pastry at the Rouxbe Online Culinary School, co-creator of Essential Vegan Desserts, and the lead instructor for Essential Vegan Desserts. And I would like to take this time to welcome everyone who's here joining me today for my our August live event. I really excited about this live event. I like this class of desserts or this family of desserts. I love the names and the history. So I'm going to get right into it. But before I do, I just would like to remind everyone, if you have a question or a further question that you would like me to answer, on the right side of your dashboard or your screen, you're going to see a Q&A. Just type it in, and I'm going to get to as many questions as I can. If I don't have an answer for you today, I will get one to you. I'm just delighted that you're here. Guests, welcome. And also, any Rouxbe students, my Essential Vegan Dessert students, I want to take a moment to welcome you and remind you that if you have a question of a technical nature, just write to support@rouxbe.com and someone from the team will get back to you quite quickly. Actually, our team is wonderful. If you have a question about an assignment, you might find in the Q&A at each unit, at each assignment, an answer to your question already there. But if not, just write a question there. And if none of that fits, just write to me. And this is for anybody who's here today. You can always write to me at fran@rouxbe.com. I want to remind any Essential Vegan Desserts students, current or past, who might not yet have joined the private Facebook group, to do that. It's a great place to interact with your fellow, that's such a funny word to me. I have to find another word, fellow, but your colleagues. And maybe you want a new piece of equipment. It's a great place to find out what other people think has worked, hasn't worked, put in your photos and so on. So I want to jump into this topic and get to your questions. So thank you again for being here. Now, it is the end of summer. I actually didn't realize until yesterday that September is starting I think in 2 days, I think on Thursday, but this is Labor Day weekend in the United States. And while it isn't really the end of summer on the calendar, it really heralds the end of summer. I know for many of you with children, school has started or is starting. That is not the case here. I was thinking today, it was quite warm in Philadelphia, and I just threw a dress on and went out and did some errands. So one of the things that I like about summer, I love summer, is that it's much easier to get dressed. There's no boots and gloves and overcoats and so on. And summer also for me means these wonderful fruits that are available. Now, I like fruit and I like vegetables. And I do eat seasonally, and apples are starting to come into the market. But for today, I'm going to be focusing on warm weather fruit, blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, peaches, all the stone fruits. And then we'll talk about what you can use in the winter. This class of dessert is really considered an old-fashioned class of dessert, and really folk desserts that certainly came into being as a way to use up fruits, sometimes vegetables that were just getting, maybe there was a very abundant harvest, or fruits that were just getting to be past their prime, bits of leftover cake or biscuits or bread. So it's really quite interesting to me. I like the history of food. So Grunts, Slumps, Cobblers, Crisps, and their cousins, Buckle, Betty, and Sonkers, and there may be some more. If any of you are aware of some other desserts that belong to this extended family, please let me know in the Q&A. So these desserts are old-time desserts, and they were cooked at home and made with some variation kitchen to kitchen. Very often the recipes were passed one to another, whether it's another family or generationally, orally. So there were not, often the recipes were not written down. And well, I would say like my grandma's recipe, I used to stand next to her and watch her make some of her cakes. One in particular was called a fluten cake, which is kind of a Russian coffee cake, until I started doing research and found out there were a lot of variations, but it was bits of fruit and bits of batter and so on, but we didn't have any measurements. And that's what these are like, because they were passed around orally and not written down, and because there were variations family to family. Definitions are hard to agree on. These are old-time, thrifty, fruit-based desserts with regional differences. So what might be called a cobbler in New England might not be called a cobbler in the South. They are, however, easy to veganize and easy to make healthier than the original recipe by using less sugar, for example, whole grain flours. You want to vary the fruits, vary the dough and or toppings, consider seasonality, combine fillings and toppings in different ways, and write down what you do so that you can pass these desserts around, assuming that the ones that you make you happy. These desserts, as I said, were thrifty and no food waste, which has become something we talk about today, but it's not new. This is something that should have been talking about, or were talking about, for decades, for generations. They were made to use up bits of bread and fruit. Now, I found this very interesting. There is a book. I was researching some of these desserts, and a book called The Foxfire Book of Appalachian Cookery, 1894, Ruth Holcomb's applesauce pie. And this is her recipe. Slice biscuits left over from breakfast or last night's supper. Spread applesauce over them. You may stir cinnamon in. Make as many layers as you like, ending with applesauce on top. Sprinkle with brown sugar. That will melt and make a crust on top. So I thought about that. How simple can that be? I have some leftover biscuits. These are the drop biscuits from the course. This is also some whole grain sourdough bread that I have. And I just might give that a try. One of my simplest galettes, a rustic pie, which means I roll out a pie dough and I put a filling in. I keep a 2-3 inch border and then crimp the filling over. It's very pretty. Is made with applesauce. If I were doing Ruth Holcomb's applesauce pie, I would slice up my biscuits, which are made with some almond flour and a bit of whole grain flour. Use homemade applesauce, season it up, and instead of the brown sugar, I would either not use any sugar or I would use coconut sugar. So that's really all there is, but I love that recipe. Now, Essential Vegan Desserts includes a recipe on, it actually includes a whole unit called Rustic Desserts, and that is these desserts, and they are rustic. So I want to go through the names of these desserts and what they are, how they are made. I want you to know that there is an event doc with this information, so you'll be able to grab it and download it if you're interested. So the first is a slump, and we have a recipe for a fruit slump in the course, but slumps are also called grunts. They tend to be called grunts in New England. So what is a slump or a grunt? It's made on the stovetop, not in the oven, and it's a high liquid fruit filling, much more liquid than you would expect in a cobbler or crisp or a pie. That's because the slump grunt is topped. Well, you make the fruit filling and you get it really hot. Now, if you want to do things ahead, you can make the filling ahead and leave it and then just rewarm it when you're ready to make this soft biscuit batter that gets dolloped on top of the hot fruit filling. The pot is closed very tightly and the dough actually steams. So I have a couple of, for example, this is something that I would use. You want to have something that's deep enough so that the dough, biscuits or cake batter, has room to grow. If you only have, if you can use a saucepan, and if you don't have a tight cover, you want to cover it up tightly with aluminum foil so that the steam stays in. So, you know, what's the difference? Why is it called a slump or a grunt? And some of you may already know this. The theory is that the biscuits are either slumping into the fruit filling or they're grunting while they are steaming. Now, Yankee Magazine, which isn't a magazine that I read, but this is their area, they concluded the Brown Betty rule of slumps and grunts is that there is no rule. So these fillings, again, contain a lot of liquid fruit juice. I don't often add much sweetener, sometimes none. You've got to taste your fruit and see how sweet it is. I like my fruit to shine and not taste of sweetener. Sometimes you need to use some. You can use maple syrup, but my slump liquid usually is water, something like orange juice and zest and the fruit. And then dollop these when the filling is hot again. I just dollop the biscuit dough on top and serve it as soon as it's finished. Serve it straight from the pan. Not exactly as soon as it's finished. I don't like to serve things that are piping hot, but still hot. And then in a bowl, you're going to have a portion of this fruit filling, which is still pretty soupy. There's no starch slurry, and a piece of the biscuit. So I've got some photos to show you. Patrick is going to show you a couple of photos of the slump. The one in the deep pot shows the biscuits after they have steamed. And the next one you're going to see is actually an Essential Vegan Dessert student upload for an assignment where the dough was just dolloped all over the batter. And then we've got the beautiful, this is a blueberry slump presented in the bowls. Now, in summer, I happen to like blueberries very much. I eat them pretty much year round on my oatmeal. You can do the fillings with fresh fruit or you can use frozen fruit. In the wintertime, one of my favorite slump combinations is pear and cranberry. So that also is really nice for the holidays that are coming up. When let's say you've made your slump grunt and you have some left over or you're not going to serve it for a while, you'll find that when it sits for a while, and I keep mine on the counter overnight, loosely covered, the fruit filling, which was very soupy, you saw the photos, actually it comes up into the topping, the biscuit dough, and it becomes more like a buckle. It's not soupy at all, so it becomes more like a buckle. Well, what's a buckle? Generally, a buckle is berries folded into cake batter, and often a crumb topping is added. It is traditionally made with berries. It is traditionally made with a crumb topping. I don't always add a crumb topping. That's up to you. And why is it called a buckle? Well, the batter is said to buckle while the dish bakes. I've talked to a number of people I know, both cooks and chefs and family, and they have people who've made buckles, and no one said they ever saw or never heard the buckling taking place. But it's cute. It's a cute idea. So you serve this in squares directly from the baking dish. I can't remember the name of the restaurant, but there was a restaurant in New York City that was famous for their blueberry buckle. And instead of serving it right out of the baking dish as a rustic dessert, they let it cool and then they cut rounds, which is very nice. Now, that's a buckle. So what is a cobbler? I mean, a cobbler has just, to me, as I look at recipes and cookbooks, it seems to be anything with fruit and a topping. So technically, a cobbler is fruit baked with a crust, often a thick biscuit dough. In the Essential Vegan Desserts version, we do a particular kind of an more unusual cobbler, and I've been making this for years, and I love it. And it's very easily varied. In fact, I know someone who used tomatoes and basil and rosemary and thyme instead of fruit to do this cobbler, and why not? But recently, I discovered that the kind of cobbler that's in the course is also known as a lazy cobbler. So what it is you take an oven-proof baking dish. This one is baked in the oven, as is the buckle. Vegan butter is melted directly in the pan. I like to do mine in a nice heavy pan or cast iron, but any baking dish will do. And while the butter is melting, and you want to watch it because you don't want it to burn, you mix up a soft batter just in one bowl. It's really easy. You pour the batter over the melted butter and you don't mix it. So it's a thin amount of batter and you'll see the butter on the sides. And then you top it with sliced fruit and berries, no sweetener, no sugar, and you don't stir it together. So yeah, that is what I have learned is a lazy cobbler. So I'm going to ask Patrick to show you some photos of this cobbler. One is baked in a round, heavy earthenware pan. And the same one with the same blueberries, raspberries, whatever I had. You know, it's a great way to use up bits of fruit. This other one was baked in just a square baking dish. And the third photo is a slice. Now, it's a wonderful dessert. It bakes in about 25 minutes. So that's not too much. It can be baked and cooled and reheated. Sometimes I even toast it. I had one small piece left over recently that I put in my freezer, and a colleague who is the pastry instructor at the Walnut Hill College, her name is Marie, came by and I said, hey, you want a piece of this? And she wrote to me. I gave her a couple of desserts to taste, and she said that was her favorite. So there you go with that. Now, cobblers and crisps tend to get mixed up. Maybe not for you, but for me, they do. What's a crisp? A crisp is fruit filling. Again, any fruit filling you want, topped with a mixture. A crisp mixture, usually butter, sugar, flour. Sometimes nuts are rubbed in. you could replace the butter. And you know that I'm talking about, I think you know I'm talking about vegan butter here for me and for the course. And that's a crisp. Or you could use a pre-made crisp topping, a really lazy, I don't want to say lazy, let's say an easy way to do it. I think of these also sometimes as component desserts. Prep your fruit, prepare your fruit, cook your fruit if you need to, and then do the toppings later. But I like to do a crisp or crumble topping ahead and bake it and have it ready to just sprinkle over some fruit and make a crisp. Now, when crumbs are layered, when these kind of crumbs are layered with the fruit, you've got a brown Betty. So there's where Betty comes in. Now, early Bettys were made with stale bread. So it was fruit filling. It could be applesauce or another fruit sauce or any combination of fruit with stale breadcrumbs. And if I were doing this, or when I have done this, I use whole grain sourdough bread. I've also used leftover cake crumbs. Sometimes I have extra cake and I crumble it up and bake it off in the oven and let it get a little bit stale and then put it in my freezer. And you can make a Betty. Now, you may have heard about, there are crisps, but there are also crumbles. So what's the difference? Well, it seems, technically speaking, that a crumble is the English cousin to our crisp, but in the topping, oats are added. So there you go, some nice rolled oats, or yeah, I would say rolled oats. I don't use instant oats when I'm adding oats. And I want to put a pin in that and tell you next month's live event is going to be all about oats, because I really like oats and I think they're a very important ingredient and healthful. So that brings me to, or brings us to, a pan dowdy. And this is something that I do make, and I think it's a lot of fun. So this is sliced fruit. A traditional pan dowdy is made with sliced apples, but you can make it with any fruit filling. And then you have a piece of pie dough, and that gets laid on top of the fruit. In the last 10 minutes or so of baking, you pull the pan out carefully with mitts and cut the pie dough and press it down into the filling. And that's called dowdying. I'm just picturing the women sitting around and thinking about I'm very curious about how they get their names. But speaking of names, I had a few people say they were interested in these desserts and they knew about these desserts, but what the heck is a Sonker? So Sonkers were new to me, but the New York Times did an article about them. Kim Severinsen, who is a wonderful journalist, wrote an article in search of the Sonker. And the conclusion was nobody knows for sure. And what you might call a Sonker over here is definitely not what you call it somewhere else. So most agree that the Sonkers history, and that's Sonker, runs back to when people from Scotland settled in Surrey County, North Carolina. It's specific to North Carolina. The Scottish had a word similar to Sonker, meaning a little of this, a little of that. Others believed it was a small grassy knoll. Well, what it is an unanchored pie crust on a loose, very loose fruit filling. And it was given the name either for its habit of sinking into the fruit, kind of like our Slump grunt, but this is pie dough. And then sinker may have morphed into Sonker, or for its resemblance to a seat or saddle, which the region's Scottish settlers called a Sonker. It really, if you search photos of Sonkers, for most of them, or many of them, actually look like a cobbler or a slump, but some you see the pie dough. And some native people from that area say it's only a sonker when it's made with sweet potato. And actually, when I went further in looking at what the heck is a sonker, I read several essays that said these women who were doing all the chores and all the cooking were really busy, and they could make a pie dough in 5 minutes. But when they didn't have time to crimp and make a pie, they would just throw a piece of pie dough over this fruit filling, stick it in the oven or the fireplace, and there you have it. So that is how we talk about these desserts. In the event doc, you're going to find some tips for making them. The ones that I talked about, the slump and the grunt don't have, and the sonker don't have a slurry, meaning any starch added. Some cobblers do to help thicken the fruit. Remember that some fruit has more pectin than others. For example, blueberries have a lot of pectin, so the filling will thicken. But don't over thicken. You don't want glue. You want these fillings to kind of ease out onto the plate. So make them seasonally, and enjoy. If you have any more questions about what I talked about or other questions, you can still put them into the chat. Oh, here's a question from my friend and colleague, Chef Shar Nolan. Many of you, I'm guessing, know Chef Shar. She is one of our Rouxbe instructors. Shar knows so much, and I often find myself asking Chef Shar questions. But for any questions about whole food, plant-based, no oil, Chef Shar is our expert. Hi, Shar. Shar and I were together on Saturday. We went to a Rouxbe Plant Pro graduate has a restaurant in a place called Pittman, New Jersey, called the Gentle Giant. And her cafe just won an award for best in the area. And we went with Chef Dimitra, who is also an instructor at Rouxbe, and we had a delicious meal and a really good time getting together. So Shar's question is, will I explain the difference in flavor between alcohol-based vanilla versus the glycerin-based variety? That's the non-alcoholic vanilla, which Shar uses in raw desserts. That's a great question, Shar, and I am going to answer that for you, but I want to remind everyone that they can go back into the live events library, and my friend and colleague and now neighbor, Chef Kathy Gold, did an event with me. Kathy knows everything about vanilla, and if you want to take a deeper dive into vanilla, just go and look at that. So, Shar, I actually looked that up and I found something I learned something interesting that I didn't know. So the FDA says in order for vanilla extract to be labeled pure vanilla extract, has to be 35% alcohol and a particular measurement of vanilla beans to a particular amount, of the jar. So it is infused. Now, the glycerin-based varieties, I didn't remember that not all glycerin is plant-based. So you want to choose your alcohol-free vanilla carefully. And if you are plant-based, which I know Chef Shar is, you want to make sure that you're getting the vegetable glycerin variety. There is a difference of opinion about the difference in flavor. Some people say or report that non-alcohol vanilla, which is often used in raw desserts, has less of an aroma than the pure alcohol extract, and other people say that it is sweeter than the alcohol, that it's sweeter than the alcohol-based vanilla. So I think you want to try. It depends a lot on the brand. There's a brand of vanilla called Halala, Heillala. Just I can look it up, and I know that it's in Chef Kathy's live event, and they are doing a non-alcohol-based vanilla extract now, and their process is a bit different. So Chef Char, I would sniff it, and if it doesn't seem as robust as your pure vanilla extract that is extracted in some percentage of alcohol, add a little more. So thank you for that question. It was good to see you. So Suzanne L has a question about crisps. Suzanne likes to make crisps with a mixture of oatmeal and flour. She wants to know, does it matter if she uses vegan butter, Miyoko's, or oil as the fat? Well, that's a good question too, Suzanne. Thank you. Actually, it doesn't really matter. It might matter flavor-wise. If you're using an oil like an extra virgin olive oil that's very green, you're going to taste it. When I use vegan butter to replace oil, or when I use oil, let me start again. When I use oil to replace butter, I use 3/4 of the amount to take into consideration the milk solids that are in butter now. So I would use less oil than I would dairy butter. But of course, vegan butter is all oil. So it should be pretty close. Start by using a little bit less. And you can use either, I add my fat to something like a crisp mixture or a crumble mixture or even a crumb crust. I add it really cautiously because sometimes you need less than the recipe suggests or states, and sometimes you need more. So thank you for that question. Amilda wants to know, are there any oil and fat-free desserts? Well, there are, Amilda, that's for sure. Essential Vegan Desserts is not a whole food plant-based, no oil course. It is a desserts course. And as all Ruby courses, we want our students to learn foundational technique before you start changing things up. So my no oil students, and I do have over time, I think this is the 6th year of Essential Vegan Desserts. I have had many students come in from courses like Forks Over Knives or Culinary RX, for example, or who are just interested in no oil, fat-free desserts, and they've done fine. You can look at fruit-based desserts, agar-based desserts, baked apples, and poached pears. I mean, there are so many desserts, or date confections don't have any added fat to them at all. Now, some of you have heard me say probably 10 times that I made Rip Esselstyn's wedding cakes, and you know that the Esselstyns are whole food plant-based and they don't use oil. Of course, for a wedding or a celebration, there was some sweetener in the cake, some small amount of maple syrup, but there was no oil and no fat. So yes, if you're going to be doing a number of cakes and pie doughs and things, Amilda, that is more difficult. I suggest that you learn the process of, I don't know where you are in your journey and your baking journey, but you learn what things are should be like, and the consistency and the flavor and so on. And then you can go ahead and find your no oil, fat-free desserts. Hi, Regina. So Regina says, I usually purchase organic cane sugar at BJ's. Lately, it's been very white with large crystals. Do you ever experience very white looking organic cane sugar? Regina, I have not seen very white cane sugar. I have noticed, so organic cane sugar and vegan cane sugar and fair trade cane sugar are usually one and the same. And they are not as white table sugar that you find in the market that we never use because they haven't been bleached and they retain a small amount of the molasses that is inherent in the cane. And that's why they're not pure white. The colors and the size of the crystal varies by brand quite a lot. So some are very, very pale beige, very pale, and some are darker. Some of the crystals are fine and some are larger, but no matter what, all the crystals are larger than a white sugar crystal. So I lightly grind mine before. So I've never shopped at BJ's, Regina. So, I don't know. I imagine it's a private label, a private label organic sugar. You know what I do? I reach out to the company and I ask questions, and you might want to do that. You might want to do that, Regina. All right, here's another question from Regina. She says sometimes her GK, I think Regina means gluten-free, GF carrot cake recipe won't rise and comes out greasy. Might you have any tips for what I might be doing wrong? The recipe contains vegan butter, gluten-free flour, flax eggs. So for those of you who don't know, flax is used as a particular kind of an egg replacer. It doesn't help with the cake rising, but it binds. Excuse me. It's usually 1 tablespoon of ground flax and 3 tablespoons of a liquid. Almonds, almond flour, carrots, leavening spice, and vanilla. Well, Regina, I can't really tell you what I think about your recipe because I haven't seen your recipe and I really would need to know the proportions or so on. But I would say if it's greasy, you might want to cut back on the amount of fat. Almond flour, nut flours add fat as well, which is a nice thing. They're very nice when used in combination with gluten-free flour mixes, but they will add some fat. So maybe you want to cut back on the amount of vegan butter. And I think you might want to up the amount of leavening from baking powder and baking soda. I see you have leavening because your flax eggs are going to bind. They're not going to leaven. Maybe try a little apple cider vinegar too to help with the leavening. So Regina, and some of you also know, I'm going to say cut your recipe in half or even by a quarter and go back to testing it. Now, let's see, Linda has a question. A diabetic friend cannot have any regular sugar. I know you don't like artificial sweeteners, but what would you use if I have no choice? Linda, I don't use artificial sweeteners. And if you were at my last live event on sweeteners, you heard me say, and again, those of you who weren't here who might be interested in the topic can go and look at the event. It was really interesting, if I do say so myself. The World Health Organization just came out with a warning on some of these sweeteners. The let's not call them artificial sweeteners, but they're really non-sugar sugars, and said they are not healthful and should not be used. And Dr. Michael Greger, nutritionfacts.org, who I'm sure many of you listen to his video, his podcasts and his talks and so on, was a proponent, a fan of erythritol, and recently, certainly within this year, said don't use it. There have been instances of problems, cardiac events, and stroke. So I don't use them. That doesn't mean you can't use them, Linda. It's entirely up to you. But when I'm doing desserts for people who are diabetic, first of all, my desserts are very small. I think that a small bit of something that's delicious with the plate filled out with healthful components like fruit, and making sure there's fiber in the dessert, and adding some spices, which are very healthy, spices and herbs, goes a long way towards helping. I am not a medical doctor, so this is my opinion, but I would give your friend a naturally sugar-free dessert, like a baked or roasted apple or a poached pear or some dried fruit compote. That's what I would do, Linda. Oh, here is a link to the Halala Vanilla product, their alcohol-free vanilla. So Charlene, Chef Char, and anybody else who's interested, I suggest you go and look at that link. It's really, their process is really interesting, and their vanilla is wonderful. And the reason for their company is really, really wonderful. So I have a question here from Nancy S. Any tips for making gluten-free Sonker or cobbler without it being gooey gummy? Gooey gummy. Yeah, we don't want gooey gummy. Is a 1-to-1 gluten-free flour the best option, like cup for cup, or is there a better combination or need to add extra of any ingredient to achieve Christmas? Yeah, gluten-free, many recipe developers and cookbook authors will say either use, that it's a 1-to-1 to wheat flour. And I have almost never found that you don't have to make some other changes when using gluten-free flour. It isn't necessarily 1-to-1. And there are so many different kinds of gluten-free flour mixes that you can make yourself or that you can purchase. I haven't used the cup for cup, but I use Bob's Red Mill 1-to-1 all-purpose gluten-free flour. Gluten-free, flour. And it's got a blue, the label is blue, and I find it works very well. I often add, unless nuts allergies are a problem, I like to add some almond flour or another nut flour to my gluten-free flour. I add some xanthan or guar gum if the baking flour mix doesn't have any. I know there are people today who don't want to use those gums, and I would add a thinner layer. So, and then in terms of Christmas, Nancy, maybe you want to run it under the broiler. So I'm going to give you the advice also of cutting a recipe in half and doing a test. Mary G wants to know which sweeteners, if any, would you recommend us not using? Mary, again, I am not a doctor, and it's just my opinion. I will tell you what sweeteners I use. I use organic cane sugar. I use whole cane sugar, which is quite brown. It contains all of the molasses that's inherent in the cane, and it's been dried and has never been extracted and put back in. I use coconut sugar quite a lot, and I use some Okinawan brown sugar. Those are my granulated sweeteners. I use, for the liquid sweeteners, I use maple syrup, date syrup, which is also known as Silan, Silan. What else do I use? Some rice syrup. I don't use barley malt anymore. Oh my goodness, I haven't used that in years, but it actually has a molasses type flavor. And I use, what is there is another one that I use that will come to me. I don't use any of the sugar alcohols. Those are the ones that I don't use. Hi, Kathy. So there's Chef Kathy Gold, who really knows so much about culinary. Kathy was the chef owner at In the Kitchen Cooking School, and my dear friend. And she is full of knowledge. She says she's agreeing with Regina. The vegan cane sugar that you bought recently is a much lighter color. Kathy lives 2 floors below me. I'd like to see it, Kathy, and then I'll be able to answer it more. What are vegan replacements for white sugars? Is Sylvia is asking. Well, the closest replacement would be vegan cane sugar. White sugar is cane sugar with everything stripped out of it. So if you see organic cane, vegan cane, or fair trade cane sugar, it's not going to be as white in color, but it is going to be very one-to-one. If you are making a chocolate cake or a carrot cake, or not a white cake or a vanilla cake or a lemon cake, where the color of the granulated sugar matters, you can use coconut sugar. Coconut sugar, you want to grind it because it's going to be far more coarse than white sugar or the cane sugar, but that's another really nice replacement. Sylvia, you can go into the live event library. There are at least 2 events I did on vegan sweeteners that are really interested. Hi, Bianca. Bianca wants to know, do we need to refrigerate sweetbread if it's made with eggs and butter? It's not typically refrigerated at the grocery store, and I wondered about the reason why, given they have eggs and butter. Well, Bianca, because they have been cooked, baked already, so it's not like keeping eggs and butter out on the counter. So you don't necessarily have to keep these sweetbreads in the refrigerator. Depends how long you're keeping them. I tend to keep things often in the freezer and then take them out. So I hope that answers your question. Sylvia has another question. This is an interesting question. If making a crumble or crisp with frozen fruit, would it be a good idea to add a thickening agent? Because when the frozen fruit is going to release probably more liquid as it defrosts. Oh, here we go. Look at that. I always have fruits and vegetables galore in my apartment in my refrigerator, because I don't want to be stuck with nothing. And then I would eat junk, but I really need to get to the grocery store tomorrow. So this is some frozen blueberries that are defrosting. I'm going to be making myself a little salad, and some frozen strawberries. You can add a little bit of thickening agent. And what I do is I use either arrowroot, do a slurry with some liquid. Don't just dump it in because it will clump. Or organic cornstarch. If I'm using cornstarch, I make sure it's organic. Otherwise, it's genetically modified. Arrowroot slurry will thicken just before it comes to the boil. And an arrowroot slurry, you want to pull it off. Well, that's what I said, just before the boil. And a cornstarch slurry, you want to cook for about a minute. But less is more. Start with less. It depends how much your fruit is doing. I don't always do it. Sometimes I just cook the filling a little longer. So I want to thank you all. Those were really good questions. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for coming. I hope you're going to enjoy this upcoming holiday weekend. Stay safe, take care of one another, eat well, and I really appreciate your being here. I hope to see you next month when we talk about oats, a really wonderful ingredient. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.